Being salt and light. We are to take a proactive approach in praying for our political leaders so that we might continue to be salt and light in this world. Here now is Gene to explain.
When David penned this particular psalm, Psalm 58, he was angry. And the reason he was angry was because of the unjust judges and leaders in Israel. And one thing about David, he had a sense of justice. Now, sometimes he misplaced that justice. He was confused in himself, but there was that heart for justice in spite of his failures. And so you see right from the very beginning his anger. I've called this particular passage right there at the beginning, verses 1 and 2, social injustice. And here's what David was saying. Do you really speak righteously, you mighty ones? And there you can see a bit of a cut in his statement. Mighty ones, you call yourself mighty ones? Do you judge people fairly? And then he answers the question. No. You practice injustice in your hearts. With your hands, you weigh out violence in the land. And to me, that's a significant statement because what he is saying is that injustice towards people begins in the heart. It's an attitude. And that attitude actually then, and he's using hands metaphorically, actually flow out of the heart. The evil of the heart flows out, not just through the mouth, but through the hands, in terms of how we treat people. And in this case, what he is simply saying is you claim to be leaders in Israel and you are appointed by God and you actually are engaging in violence against human beings. So this is a very serious issue. In fact, when you study the history of Israel, there's a lot of injustice that is outlined in the Old Testament on the part of kings, on the part of judges, on the part of even religious leaders. And that existed even up until the time of Jesus, because Jesus dealt with injustice among the religious leaders in Israel at the time that he walked the earth. So injustice is a prevalent problem. And we see it illustrated in Scripture, and you certainly see it illustrated. If it happens to God's chosen people, imagine the injustice that has existed outside of that among the nations who deny God and totally have turned their back on the will of God. One of the most classic illustrations, I think, of dealing with injustice and seeing this injustice, it was in the day of Nehemiah. And you remember the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was in Babylonian captivity, cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. And he had heard that he got a report that the walls had been burned, the gates had been burned in Jerusalem, and the people that were still in that area were suffering terrible injustices. And he wanted to do something about it. The only thing he could do about it was pray that he might have favor with the king. And God did give him favor with the king, a pagan king. And he was able to go back to Jerusalem. And he was able to rally the troops. And he was able to begin the rebuilding process of the gates and of the walls. And it's a marvelous story because they were able to complete that process in just several months. But in the middle of that process, he was confronted with the injustice that existed in Judah at that time. In fact, let me just read to you from Nehemiah chapter 5, which is actually entitled Social Injustice. We read, there was a widespread outcry from the people and their wives against their Jewish countrymen. This was a Jewish problem. Some were saying, we, our sons and our daughters, are numerous. Let us get grain so that we can eat and live. Others were saying, we're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, our homes to get grain during the famine. Now, this is a problem that Nehemiah is facing in the midst of trying to rebuild these walls. Still others were saying, we have borrowed money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Even though they were Jews and somewhat self-contained, they still had to pay a tax to the king. And this would involve probably Artaxerxes himself, who had given Nehemiah the privilege and helped him to come and help these people. It goes on to say, verse 5, we and our children are just like our countrymen and their children, yet we are subjecting our sons and daughters to slavery. They were actually to survive selling their sons and daughters into slavery to their own people, to the judges and the leaders in Israel. You talk about injustice. Some of our daughters are already enslaved, but we're powerless because our fields and vineyards belong to others. In other words, what are they going to do in the midst of all of this injustice on the part of the other leaders or the leaders in Israel? Well, you can guess Nehemiah's response. He was angry. We read in verses 6 and following, I became extremely angry. And by the way, this is an illustration of righteous anger. And Jesus definitely illustrated righteous anger there when he went into the temple, you remember? And the money changers were there and taking advantage of people. You talk about injustice. The way they were abusing people, manipulating people for their own ends. And he took that cord, overturned the tables, drove the sheep and the goats out of the temple because they were there selling these animals for sacrifice at exorbitant prices to people that had come to worship in the temple from other parts of the Roman world. Righteous anger. And Nehemiah illustrates this. I became extremely angry when I heard their outcry and these complaints. After seriously considering the matter, I accused the nobles and officials. There you have it. Here you have an illustration of what was bothering David in this psalm. I accused the nobles and officials, saying to them, each of you is charging his countrymen interest. And their interest per se was not the issue, it was usury. It was taking advantage of people, exorbitant interest, in order to pad their own pockets and to get them into a state of even more poverty. So, Nehemiah said, I called a large assembly against them, and I said, we have done our best to buy back our Jewish countrymen who were sold to foreigners. We ourselves have taken money from our own pockets, those of us who've come back to help you, and yet now you sell your own countrymen and we have to buy them back. And he's angry. And rightfully so. And notice the response. God was with Nehemiah, and they knew he was telling the truth. And they remained silent and could not say a word. Now, that's righteous anger. In Jesus' day, when the political and religious culture was far more separated, particularly beyond the Judean region, we see how Jesus taught us to handle injustice. You see, you have a different cultural situation now, which is true as history unfolds in different parts of the world. And so here is Jesus now in Galilee, where you have him teaching, and he's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. And there are people that are being mistreated by their Jewish brothers, their Jewish religious leaders, but they're also being mistreated by the Roman world. You have a different cultural situation. And so here's what Jesus said. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled on by men. So he uses the metaphor of these people listening to him there on the mount. He goes on to use another metaphor. You are the light of the world. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. And let me simply say that if you go to Israel and you sit on that mountain where Jesus was teaching, you can look across the Sea of Galilee. And on the other side, if you were there sitting at night, you could see the twinkling of lights of the cities. In fact, there were towns and cities all around the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus spent a number of months right there, almost 2 years, as he was going from city to city and town and teaching and preaching. But they could imagine the metaphor and what he's referring to when he said, "You're the light of the world, a city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. You can see it." Then he uses another metaphor. He says, "No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but rather on a lampstand, and it gives light for all who are in the house." And then he makes the application. "In the same way, let your light shine before men so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." So what is Jesus teaching us in relationship, first of all, to our life in this world, living in a culture that is hostile to Christianity? The first thing he's teaching us is that we're to be light and salt in this world. Now, as the gospel penetrated, after Jesus went back to heaven, penetrated the Roman culture, you have more and more of an influence of the Roman government on the lives of Christians. In fact, the culture became hostile, very hostile to Christians. And so when Paul wrote to the Corinthians, who lived in the city of Corinth, which is a very immoral city, a very strong Roman city, a pagan city, the gospel penetrated that city. And what did Paul say to the Corinthians in relationship to the world in which they lived? Well, notice, I've entitled this "Imitating Jesus Christ," because that's exactly what Paul says. But notice the categories of people that we are to imitate Christ for and to. "Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do everything for God's glory." That's the first thing he says that should be true in our lives, regardless of the cultural situation in which we live. As Christians, we are to be light, we're to be salt. And here Paul is speaking to the same issue. Then he gets specific. He says, "Give no offense to the Jews or the Greeks or the church of God." That's everybody. The Jews, your fellow Jews, the Greeks, the pagans, the Romans, or the church of God, those who are believers. "Just as I also try to please all people in all things." And that all people includes everyone in the world in which he's living. Now, he's not talking about compromise, but he's talking about living a life that reflects Jesus Christ in the midst of a culture that is anti-Christ. And so he explains, "Not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, so that they may be saved." And then he says to these Corinthians, "Imitate me as I also imitate Christ." And obviously that comes from a man who was an apostle and was inspired to write those words. I think what we ought to be saying as believers to everyone that's looking in on who we are as churches, as families, as marriages, we should be able to say, first and foremost with our lives, "Imitate me as I also imitate Jesus Christ." And this is one of God's plans, you see, in dealing with injustice in the world in which we live. Imitating Jesus Christ.